Afternoon, I suppose, assuming you're on the US East Coast. Welcome wherever you are. We're here for a session on salary negotiation. We have until 1 p.m., so the better part of an hour. I am an associate professor at the Johns Hopkins Business School, and as Roshni has already mentioned, I have been arranging a series of workshops, some offered by myself, some by colleagues, mostly from the business school, on a variety of topics that have to do with professional development. Today, we're going to focus on salary negotiation. So quick biographical sketch here. As I mentioned, currently with the Johns Hopkins Business School, I've been affiliated with the school for about a dozen years. PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, and I have had some executive experience. I spent about a decade in the, let's call it the real world, with various roles, including some leadership and management activities, and in particular in business development, applied research and consulting. I also had the opportunity to hire and manage teams of PhDs. We used to call them quants because these were typically people who had very significant mathematical background and could use that often in a financial setting to help with financial modeling. I'm also currently a member of an investment committee for a venture capital firm and have been serving as a consultant for startups. So I am not an ivory tower academic. I am actually involved in real world activities and happy to share any of those thoughts or ideas or experiences with you should you have an interest. So moving on with salary negotiation specifically, these are some of the concepts, items, little headlines that we'll be covering today. Each of these has a couple of slides associated with it. So instead of reading down the list, I'll let you just scan through that for now. And let's move on with the first item. You can't negotiate a standard contract. This is a very common quote people encounter or are worried about encountering. And it's often invoked, particularly by human resources representatives from potential prospective employers, to suggest to us that there's no room to negotiate. Right? If you say to someone, this is the standard contract, everyone gets the same wording, it gives the impression that, hey, this is a take it or leave it, that's the way it is. But they're not really specifically saying that you can't negotiate, right? In many cases, they're just hoping that you'll get the impression it's non-negotiable and just move on. So keep in mind that it costs you nothing to ask politely, and you'll see the theme of politeness come throughout the afternoon here, but it costs you absolutely nothing to ask, using perfectly appropriate language, whether any specific changes are possible. The worst thing they could possibly do is say no, and more specifically and emphatically indicate that, in fact, you cannot negotiate the contract. If you're polite, such a question, request for clarification, won't be held against you. So the next item I want to touch on is the importance of preparing in advance. And specifically here, I'm looking at preparing by looking up compensation data. So you should know your net worth, and here by your worth, of course, I'm referring to the commercial sense, your value to the employer. And that can be achieved by searching, and these days online, there are lots of resources you could search online and determine what is reasonable compensation for your particular field, for your stage of professional development, for your level of experience. You can and should do this in advance. And also keep in mind that your compensation may not just be monthly salary, it may include bonuses, equity awards, etc., in particular if you're outside the academic world. There are various discipline or industry-specific sources. So dentists, physicians, academicians, private practitioners, government employees, nonprofits, etc. There's probably somewhere out there a database with ranges of reasonable compensation for your particular field and experience. Find that information, because it's hard to credibly negotiate unless you know what the appropriate ranges are. And then the other element of preparing in advance is to get some practice. You can expect to encounter tough questions in interviews, but also potentially in negotiations. If you want to get more than just the standard contract or the first offer that's put in front of you, then you need to speak, and the other party may then ask you some pointed questions in an effort to establish that you do or don't deserve whatever you're asking for. So you need to be prepared for that. And you can be sure, certainly through the interview process, which precedes typically the negotiation process, but the interview process, someone somewhere, and possibly more than one person, is going to push you with the harder questions, and they may also exhibit a more rough attitude, which they may be doing on purpose just to test you, or that just may be their personality. The key is that you have to perform well, which means you have to answer professionally and credibly, regardless of what the question is. So the more questions you rehearse, the better your answers will be, the more polished they'll be, the higher your own confidence will be when you're faced with something new and unexpected. So of course we can prepare for the predictable questions, and it's very easy to find predictable interview questions through online resources and through the various resources we have on campus. So those we can prepare for, but the more we do that, the more polished we look and the better prepared we are for unexpected questions. Another important element in negotiations is not to issue ultimatums. We have a somewhat brash culture that often predisposes us to believe that negotiation is about taking a hard stance and playing hardball. And that's not the type of negotiation I'm referring to. Yes, there are some people who will emphasize that and try to convince you that that's the way to go. I don't believe it is. I believe the purpose of salary negotiation is not to intimidate others, but rather to reach an outcome that both parties are happy with. If both parties are happy with the outcome of any negotiation, it helps to ensure the agreement will be long-lasting. And that benefits everyone. If what you're getting is achieved through bullying, you're going to make some enemies, and you can be sure that there will be people who will look for every possible opportunity to get out of that contract with you. So my advice here is you should not issue ultimatums, and if other people do from the other party, just ignore them. That's probably the best thing to do. Is rather than getting into conversations related to ultimatums, it's often best to just try to bypass them completely, because again, they tend to lead to dead ends. I should also mention that I'm happy to entertain questions at any time. So if anything occurs to you, please toss it into the chat box. I do have that open, or if we have the option for you to unmute and speak, I'm happy to listen to you vocalize your question. So moving on from the ultimatums part, be genuinely enthusiastic. This is very important. You need to show sincere interest in the role, assuming you have sincere interest in the role, but you need to show that. Employers know that some of the candidates will take jobs elsewhere. So if they're interviewing 20 people for 2 positions, they may make 4 offers, assuming that 2 of those will be turned down. And of course, I'm making up some numbers there, but just to get the point across. So they know some people won't take the jobs that are offered. So at least subconsciously, they will be gauging how likely you are to actually take the job. And if it seems to them that you're not really sincere, then when they're having conversations with their colleagues and saying, well, who should we make our top 4 or 5 list? What's our short list? And they're considering your case, one of them or more is going to say, well, this person seemed to be really, really skilled, but they just didn't seem really enthusiastic. I just got a sense that they're looking at other offers and they're more excited at the possibility of going elsewhere, right? And if they get that sense, they may not include you on the short list. They may not give you the offer. Or if you're negotiating, they may decide not to negotiate hard with you because they may just feel that you're just going to be wasting their time and going somewhere else, regardless of what they put on the table for you. So that inclination on their part to disengage is already bad for you. It means that they won't be fully engaged in the negotiation, and that clearly is second best for you. So be genuinely enthusiastic. Feel comfortable about showing it. They'll appreciate that. So I thought I'd share my first job negotiation example. I just finished a PhD on the East Coast, and I had a job offer from a company in San Francisco. I had gone there and interviewed, and then I went again a second time. By now we knew, at least in principle, that an offer was forthcoming. So this was exciting. This was a really fun company. I'd really looked forward to talking to. I had a colleague who had already gone and been hired there, so I had a better sense of what it was like on the inside. And they made me an offer, which by any measure was pretty good, and I'm perfectly comfortable sharing the numbers with you. So this was in the year 2000. It was the year 2000. And the base salary was $120,000, and the bonus on an annual basis was $60,000. It was a guaranteed first-year bonus. And they also offered to pay up to $10,000 in relocation costs from East to West Coast. So that was the offer I had on the table. And there was an understanding that down the road, there could be some equity ownership as well. But it was too early to get into that, and they made that clear that the incoming associates don't receive equity awards. So my experiences with the company were very favorable. We got along really, really well. And I say we, I mean, just about everybody I met there was like-minded, and it was really an exciting time for me. And then at the end of the second visit, another couple of days of visiting, I met with the CEO and asked him whether the salary and bonus were negotiable. And he said to me that to some extent I had him over a barrel, which was an interesting choice of words for him. He said, look, everybody here likes you, and if I don't get you signed, they'll be angry with me. So you could push more, and I would probably have to give it to you. But if you do that, then you're going to create much higher expectations, and we're going to be looking at you. We're going to put you under a microscope, because if we're paying you more, we're going to have to make sure that we're getting our money's worth. So I decided not to push more. I felt that it would be the wrong thing to do, having been told that by the CEO, to then go and push him against the wall and wring something out of him that might then create some animosity, even if it was buried somewhere deep. So this is why I'm describing this as know when to stop pushing. And of course, this is a single example, one anecdotal example of just me and my experiences, and your circumstances certainly are different. So, but this is a choice you have to make in the moment. You have to decide, you have to gauge the temperature in the room. Of course, there was just him and myself in the room at the time. And you have to make a decision that you're going to be happy with, that they're going to be happy with, because again, the emphasis, I believe, should be on a long-term commitment to each other, right? That's the ideal job, is where everyone feels that there's a real bright future for you together. And negotiation is collaborative because you're all trying to get to a point where everybody's happy. There's a question, if you ask to negotiate and they agree to your negotiation, are you then expected to take the job? No, it really depends on the choice of words. If part of if what you're saying to them is ultimatum style, if you don't give me an extra 10,000, then I'm not taking the job, and they say, okay, we'll give it to you, and then in a sense, your choice of words has implied that you're agreeing to take the job. But that in itself does not necessarily obligate you to take the job at that point. So I think the word that's used in the question itself, expected, really is the key. Now, what expectations have you formed within the other party based on your word choices? It looks like, I hope I answered that question fully, Vicky, and if I haven't, please redirect. Moving on to the next question, was I already content with the offered pay and chose not to push for more? So yeah, I knew going in that this was roughly the range. I knew that people graduating with PhDs in finance in particular, that year, that was around the right baseline of about 110, 120, and that the bonus was pretty reasonable. The company also explained to me that there was very good upside should everything work well between us. So I knew that there were also significant possibilities. And we get to my next example, I'll go through some of those numbers as well. And also putting it in context, my father was an academician who was, probably fair to say, the leading researcher in his field of pediatric exercise physiology at the time. And my starting salary, he was a full professor with 200 publications, and this starting salary would have been more than he had ever earned in his life. So yeah, to me, these were big numbers. And yes, I was happy to take that. I was also aware that there were possibilities for more, and that was sufficient for me at the time. All right, so thank you for the questions, and I'm happy to address others. So let's move on. It's important to negotiate all your issues together. So if you have a list, you've gone through the contract, you've had conversations with people, you've taken in all of the verbal information they're shared with you, and you've created a short list of 3, 4, 5 items that you would like changed, that you want to negotiate. So keep in mind, the employer is always busy. They have things to do, whether it's the HR person dealing with you or someone who's more discipline specific, someone who might be your direct boss. Whoever it is, they've got stuff to do. So they want to get your deal wrapped up and then move on to other priorities, whether it's negotiating with other people, bringing them on board, or getting on with the business of running that department. So if that counterparty thinks the negotiations have concluded because you've said that, no, I have this one issue, and then you explain it and they deal with it for you, and then after that, they're ready to have the contract signed, and then you say, oh, wait a minute, there's one other thing, and then you spend another week negotiating that. And then again, when they feel that everything's done, you say, oh, and there was this one other thing. You can imagine that's going to drive people crazy. So you do not want to irritate people. Be organized, be comprehensive as you go through and collect your thoughts, write things down, run them by whoever is willing to serve as a sounding board for you. And once you're comfortable with what you want to ask, put that forward as one package. You may get some of the items there, you may get none, you may get all of them. Regardless, once you've put them forward and they've been addressed with a favorable or unfavorable resolution, it's time to move on. And when I say move on, it's either say yes or say no, thank you, and move on to other offers. And also make it easy for the employer. This relates somewhat to the previous comment, but generally, so be polite and communicate clearly. That clarity is important. Very important to understand the employer's circumstances and constraints. And this is where having a network with a person who's within the company or familiar with the company can be very helpful, because understanding the counterparty's circumstances and constraints means that you can zero in on the things that are most important for them, and you can make them comfortable that that's what they're going to get out of this agreement. So you don't want to waste the employer's time, and they will appreciate it if you're efficient and professional. So that also means don't play games, don't be coy, respond in timely fashion if they're reaching out to you for clarification, more information, sending you documentation, and so on. And also be likable. And this be likable theme is also going to carry through with some of the other comments I'm going to make. Question in chat, are you aware of any strategies to counter the female gender penalty in negotiations from the socialists where women can be viewed as unfavorably aggressive when asking for the same compensation as a man? I've had experiences hiring men and women. Generally, what I've found is that women tend to be more timid. They simply tend to not ask as much. And there's lots of literature that documents this. Women tend to exhibit lower self-confidence for a variety of reasons. We probably don't have time to get into all of those. And of course, that lower self-confidence is not warranted objectively. They're as capable, as knowledgeable, and bring comparable experience, whether it's a lot or little, regardless of which level of experience they're applying for. So it's just, cultural influences, history, lots of different influences cause that. Try to sort of rack my brains here for a specific example. I can't come up with anything specifically. Yes, this does happen. We know it's a thing. So I suppose what I would say is, if you're encountering that and you're convinced, when I say you, I mean the royal you, right? Anybody out there who's seeking that kind of information or an opinion, if you feel that really this is what you're getting, that's the attitude you're encountering, then you should really be thinking about, is this a place I want to go? Because if this place is so unenlightened that they're going to be treating me this way just for speaking up and asking reasonable questions, which are going to apply to my compensation, my living needs over time, then maybe I just don't want to go here. So I think that's something to consider, right? If you should go where you're going to be appreciated and respected and compensated appropriately, which is to say equitably with everyone else, regardless of gender or anything else. So if you get a sense that that particular place is not going to honor that, then maybe there's a good chance that that's not really the place for you. Next question, should you ask for more than you would take since you expect they will bring it down? So yes, you can do that. And I'm going to address the rescind the offer thing. You can do that within reason. So if they advertise this job as being $100,000 starting salary, and you go in there with some numbers and other things and say, oh, I believe it's reasonable for me to ask for 120, it's a reasonable thing to ask. And of course, then there are the usual choices. They can say, we're sorry, that we've never paid income associates that much, and we just can't. Or we've never paid that much, but we can look into it. Or they might counter and say 110 or 105, or they might say, lots of other things they could say. That's one thing. But if you know the starting salary is around 100 and you say, I want 300,000, they're going to know you're not a serious person. And they're most likely going to walk away at that point. So you will have burned a bridge just by making a foolish comment at that point. So it's a matter of degree, right? If you're asking for more, but it's within a reasonable range, then I would not be concerned about them rescinding the offer, as long as you have some reasons for why you're putting that number forward, and you do so politely and professionally. If you're going to argue that you have more work experience than the average person they're hiring, or that your specialty, educational specialty, is highly, highly in demand and rare, and that your the additional education you've done really puts you into a very, very unique subset of people, that could be reasonable. Negotiating timelines, absolutely. You should and can negotiate timelines. And start times, in particular, if you need to wrap up projects with your PI, yes. Finishing up your PhD, it's quite likely that they're going to demand, as part of your hiring, that you complete the PhD, because presumably they're looking at you because they want PhD level graduates. So you may be graduating them when you're in your final year and you're expecting to defend dissertation and complete in 6 months. Don't be surprised if they say to you, well, we're going to put your starting date here on the timeline, but it's understood that you need to complete the PhD. So you need to choose dates that are going to be appropriate, because if you have a delay in getting the PhD, that could impact their ability or inclination to hire you. So yes, that is a thing. But I remember in my case, I was interviewing with this very company, the one I described earlier. I think it was probably in October or November of a given year, and the hiring was for June of the next year. I anticipated defending and completing dissertation in early spring, so February, March. And at some point, there was a talk that we might need to delay my defense by a month or so. And I contacted the company and said, hey, just be aware of this. And they said, well, is there a chance that you won't get the PhD? And at that point, I felt comfortable that everything was still lined up. So I was able to say that to them. But I got the impression that if I then said to them, well, yeah, there's a chance that this is not going to happen on the PhD side, that they may have then felt that, that they need their people to be credible in front of their clients, and the PhD is important. And yes, this could be a problem with your PI. That opens up a whole other can of worms, which is probably beyond the scope here, just given our time constraints. But your PI could be very helpful in the process, or they could be the ones who are putting up a lot of barriers, and that can be really unfortunate. So the hope is that you have a good enough relationship with the PI that they will be flexible and supportive. And again, it's a little beyond our scope here if they turn out to not be. How do I recommend someone accurately determine their own market value? Very vague or inconsistent. Right, so there's nothing wrong with you choosing to say, well, the range is mid, 90s to 150. I think I'm 140, and the reason for that is because I'm graduating from a prestigious institution with outstanding faculty and resources, which means I've been educated at the top level of that range, and I've also had some experience in industry or with teaching or research or trials, or whatever you can think of that makes a story, that contributes to a credible story for why you are asking for this end of the range or the other. What you should not do is go in at the lowest end of the range, right? That's a defeatist strategy, which often would be associated with someone who lacks confidence and is just hoping and begging, praying that they will get an offer. And that tends to not go over well with employers, right? They want to see that you're confident in your own abilities, that you are capable, and ideally that others want you as well and are making offers to you. And we'll get into that in a moment. So I hope that's a sufficient answer there. Right, so we've completed everything on this screen. Also very important during negotiations is to be honest, right? No bluffing. Never lie in an interview. Inevitably, lying will come back to haunt you. And lying is really hard because you have to keep track of which lie you told to which person. So if you're interviewing with several people at a given company, and for whatever reason you've decided to not be honest, by the time you get to the fourth or fifth person, you're trying to remember, well, what did I say to that person? What did I say to that person? And that's not a good way to put your best foot forward. Of course, it's not a good way to go through life. So the only and best path is to be honest at all times, right? That way you don't need to remember stories. You just have to answer honestly. And if you do choose to go down the path of bluffing / lying, and someone calls that bluff, then your credibility is probably irreparably undermined at that institution. And depending on how closely knit the industry is, it may even harm you elsewhere because people talk. And so, there are friends who work at different institutions, and if you pop up for an interview somewhere, the person who's interviewing may have heard something about you from some other place where perhaps you left a bad impression. So do not bluff, right? This is not the place to bluff. Do seek collaborative middle ground. I already made this comment. A good outcome is one where all parties feel like winners. The employer secures your services on terms that work for her. You receive terms that are favorable for you and or your household. So you should negotiate openly and in good faith. This can be helpful because the more open you are, the more they understand your needs, and the more it opens up the possibility for all of you to find a creative solution. If all you do is say, I must have $125,000 in starting salary, you're avoiding an outcome where maybe they can offer you 115, but the reason you want 125 is because you need 10,000 for moving expenses. And if you'd been open, they would have then be able to say, well, sure, we have a program to give you up to $10,000 in moving expenses. Easy solution, but only if you're open and share enough information. Always use constructive language. Always be clear regarding what you're seeking to achieve. It makes everybody's job easier. If you ask for higher salary, will the company later give you more workload? If they want to lay off people, will they start laying off people who are asking for a higher package? So yes, there's a lot to unpack there. So bottom line is, if you're good and they're a company that recognizes people who are good and productive, they'll be happy to pay you more. And even if times are rough, they will know that you are one of the stars and they won't even consider laying you off. If, on the other hand, you are one of these people who pushed for more, and going back to the personal example I shared with you, because you had leverage at the time, and they ended up giving you a good package, and you don't perform to that level, now you've got a big X on you. And if times do turn bad, that's going to be their excuse to get rid of you. And so if you're going to ask for more, which is perfectly reasonable if you can earn it, if you're good enough, you just have to perform well. And companies don't lay off their stars. If you're likable and do the job well, you should be okay. It's only when you underperform that people will begin to say, well, this person's not very productive and they're expensive. Now, will the company give you more workload? It's almost a guarantee that as you prove yourself and you show that you're capable, that lots of people in the company will be more than happy to bring you in and give you more stuff to do. And that's just a normal thing. You need to choose at that point, when do you push back? A lot of people who are in their first year are not going to be pushing back because they want to show that they can do the job and they don't want to look like they're complaining about the workload. So it's probably wise to just do the work and show that you can do it really, really well. And then once your capabilities are respected and appreciated, then you can set a meeting with your direct supervisor or boss and say, I really appreciate you setting the time. I've been here a year, 2, whatever the number is, and I feel like I do good work, but I'm also feeling like I'm getting pulled in so many directions and lots of people are giving me stuff to do. And now I'm at the point where I really feel like I'm hitting some inefficiencies. So can we figure out a way to maybe pass some of these other items off to some of the newer folks and so on? Those are completely reasonable conversations to have. Don't negotiate with yourself. So this means don't get caught up in a situation where you're going off on this long monologue. They've offered you, you start off by saying, well, I'd really like 130,000 a year, but I understand if times are tough for you, so I would be okay with 120. And I also know that, we've got COVID now, so 110 would also be okay. And really, I think I could probably make ends meet with 95K, right? That would be the most ridiculous one-sided negotiation where you were constantly undermining your own position and giving up ground without any reason to, because what you should do is say, well, I'd really like to be at 130 and I believe I deserve it. I believe I'm worth it. And then you got to zip it and wait for them to say something so that you can get the negotiation dynamic going where they give some ground and you give some ground. It's not necessarily how it's going to play out, but that you've got to set it up that way. So you've got to get another question. If I got a package for company A better than B, but prefer B, absolutely. You can and you really should, right? If you've got a solid offer, you absolutely should. Because remember, and I'm going to get into the employer's perspective in a moment, just want to make sure I do that. But in fact, you know what, let's do that. Let's see. Yeah, okay, we're actually pretty close to that. So let's park that question, please. I'll go through these slides and then I'm going to be answering. And if I don't answer it fully, please ask the question again. So yes, we know that there are a lot of stresses. Many of you have expressed or reflected some stresses through the questions you're asking. We have this issue of, am I worth this much? If I don't push back, will I end up with a bad deal? I'll be disappointed for the next 5 years. If I do push back, will I alienate them? Will they rescind my offer? If I appear to be difficult and so on. Very common stresses. So how do we alleviate stress? One is to have the confidence, and another is to have a sense of control. A lot of attention is paid to what you do during the interview, but I've already attempted to emphasize that much of your preparation happens in advance, right? When you're looking up reasonable salary ranges, when you're reading about the company, all of those things are really, really important. But let's say a few words first about confidence and control. So one way you can reduce that stress is by gaining confidence. I believe this is an audience of PhD students. So we all already know the PhD programs are challenging. We learn a lot about ourselves. We learn a lot that's nothing to do with our field of study. We feel that our vulnerabilities and weaknesses are exposed, and that undermines our self-confidence. Even if you lack work experience, remember that no new employees know how to do everything on day one. So there is no requirement that you step into a job and be perfect at everything. You may think that's the case, especially with a PhD, because we feel like, well, at a PhD level education, we can no longer say, I don't know. We have to come up with an answer. And what if we don't have one? It's still okay to say, I don't know, but you have the skills to go find the answer. And that's what you assure your employer. And then you go ahead and do it. So also give yourself credit for your successes, put them in proper context, and trust in your intellect. Right? You got there because you're a smart person, you're capable. You got through all the hurdles in a very tough PhD program. And that means a lot. It may not feel like it because you're so focused on the program. And there are disappointments and sometimes even devastations as we go through it. And those exposed vulnerabilities and weaknesses make us lose confidence, but really we should have much more faith in ourselves because we should be focusing on what we've achieved, not the anxieties that have been raised. So, and I sometimes use these sort of numbers. Obviously, it may be a little silly, but as a Hopkins PhD student, you're probably in the 99th percentile of the population in terms of skills in your particular field, in terms of intellect and so on. That may not be completely accurate, maybe a little self-congratulatory, but I think there's something to be said for that observation, right? You've earned your right to get into these highly competitive programs and you've graduated from them. So while there's room to be humble always, you should recognize what you've accomplished. And objectively, when you compare yourself to the rest of the population, you've got a lot going for you. And the irony I touched on in the previous slide is that PhD education process leaves us feeling that we know nothing, and it encourages that self-doubt. But you know a heck of a lot more than you think. So you need to get comfortable speaking about your interests, your abilities, your accomplishments, your aspirations. And the more you do this, the better you'll get at it. And the more confident you'll feel in your ability to make a good impression, which is hugely important during interviews and the negotiation. So the more you do it, the better you get at it. You've got to practice it. I already mentioned that before, right? In one of the opening slides. Practice, practice, practice. It makes a huge difference. And then regarding a sense of control, you want to remove as many uncertainties, again, through advanced preparation. You want to research the employer in advance, find out who will be interviewing you. Can you look that person up on LinkedIn or on the corporate website and figure out what they're about, what their experiences were? I'm not suggesting you stalk anyone here, but yeah, it's completely legitimate for you to use whatever's available to you online to find out who these people are and what makes them tick. And identify common interests, professional and personal. You also will want to speak with current or former employees. So use your network, again, to get a sense of what the culture's like. Are they friendly? Are they open? All the things that will help you to have a more constructive conversation when you're actually on. And come equipped with the actual numbers and facts, right? The compensation ranges and so on. So there was a question about, the compensation range is vague. It's 90 to 150. At least that's a range, right? That already creates a structure for the conversation. It allows you to say, I believe I should be near the top of the range. And you can start from there and you tell a story, a credible story for why you think that's the case. All right, so let's dive into here the employer's perspective. I think this is very important because it touches on a lot of the questions that have been asked. So in a world where there are dozens or even hundreds of applicants for every position, it's normal for the employer to have the upper hand in the early stages. And that's what gives us some of that anxiety about, oh, they've got so many of these choices. If I'm a boat rocker, if they see me as a boat rocker, will they just say, well, forget it, we're taking that offer away. So there's an interesting psychological change in the power dynamic once you receive an offer, because remember, the employer has gone through those hundreds of people, and on paper, you must have looked really, really good to them. And if they're making you an offer, then in person, you must have looked really, really good to them. So they've decided that you should be on that short list. They're already, the very act of giving you the offer means that they've put a lot of capital, sort of emotional and sometimes political capital on the line in liking you and wanting you. Having to turn to someone else who's lower on their list is a disappointment, right? They feel like, oh, we didn't really want to go down this deep on our short list, but now we have to, and we're disappointed because you chose to go somewhere else, to take a job somewhere else. So you do have some leverage there. Once they make you an offer, you have some leverage. And it may be small or large amount, that's to be determined based on circumstances, but it's probably fair to say that you have the most leverage you will have during the process. Once you accept the offer, of course, you lose most or all of that leverage. And if you move your whole family somewhere, then you certainly have lost all leverage, because now they know that you're sort of stuck there, is maybe not the best choice of words, but clearly by then you've negotiated everything, you've signed, you've moved, you've given up all the other choices you have. So yeah, you've got no leverage or very little leverage compared to when they first make you the offer. So asking for clarification on elements of the contract or requesting changes are completely reasonable things to do. No employer will want to lose one of their top choices over something they can deal with easily. And if they can accommodate the request, they'll probably do it. If they're unable to, they'll just tell you. And hopefully they'll be open and professional about it, so that you can respond openly and professionally. The key, again, is, see that theme of politeness and honesty. Be polite, be honest, and be reasonable. That's important. Be reasonable. Remember that I'm assuming that you're looking for a job that's not going to be a 6-month gig, but is going to be a 6-year, 16-year, 26-year opportunity. And so you want to be reasonable to give that opportunity a chance to actually happen and manifest. And if they're the right place for you, they will respond precisely in the same way. They will want to be reasonable with you and hope that you will be loyal to them for the long term. Right, internships are very different. And because internships can be so wide ranging in their terms, I'm not even going to attempt to get into much detail there, other than to saying that, again, there's absolutely no reason, nothing's stopping you from saying, is this negotiable? Is there any flexibility in this number? Right? Those simple sentences are perfectly reasonable sentences. You haven't made any demands. There's no ultimatum. It's a really simple, is there any scope for this to be changed? And they can quickly come back to you and say yes, no, or perhaps. And that leads you to the next step. If it's a clear no, then it's a no. If it's a yes or perhaps, then you can pursue that. So we know the employer most likely has many applicants, and what's big good ones. If I'm giving this talk to a general audience, I would use this point. You have somewhat of an advantage. If you're graduating from Johns Hopkins University with a PhD in any field, you are an outstanding candidate on paper. I think it's fair to say that without loss of humility here. And it may be the case that the employer doesn't have many applicants who are as qualified as you. So that actually does suggest that you may have more leverage than the average person, because probably there aren't 300 people applying for this job. There may only be 6 people qualified in the world who are graduating with PhDs that year. In any case, the employer wants to pick good candidates, and so it's a very strong signal if you can show that others are interested in you. So this answers that earlier question about, should I let the employer know that someone else has made me an offer? And the answer to that is an emphatic absolutely yes. Find a subtle way or even unsubtle way to make that clear. Because it only looks good for you, right? One of the questions employers have when they're hiring someone who doesn't have any work experience is, well, they seem super smart, but can they do the job? Have they ever been in our type of stressful corporate situation? Whatever it is, you're still potentially an unproven quantity. The fact that others are clamoring for your attention and willing to give you offers helps to allay that concern in their minds, because they feel like, oh, well, there's lots of other people who think this candidate is great, so that reinforces for us that this person's great. So absolutely, you should provide that. And yes, it's completely reasonable at the end of your thinking process, and after you've considered and communicated and asked for clarification from two companies, to choose the one that pays less, because you may have been convinced through that process of asking your own questions that you'll be happier there. When I finished the PhD, I had offers from Wall Street, and they were higher than the one for the job I took in San Francisco. But it was clear to me that the people in San Francisco liked each other, and it was fun hanging out with them. And the Wall Street offer I got was from a specific unit that had difficulty hiring because they had two big factions, and they kept turning down each other's or vetoing each other's candidates. So I just sensed that the dynamics they had in the office were terrible. And it made more sense to take the lower dollar offer to be in a happier place. You're giving yourself a gift when you make that choice, right? Because you're setting yourself up for success rather than being miserable. Somewhat higher salary is not worth misery. And of course, I'm saying that from a position of relative privilege. Obviously, the starting salary I was describing is a handsome amount that one would be happy to get. So it's not like I was making a decision that would have implied financial hardship. All right, so I guess we can move on to that second negotiation example. It's a reasonable segue here. So I spent about 4 years with that particular employer, and it was, looking back, the best job I've ever had, possibly with the exception of now being a professor, which I really like. But it was sort of time that we had been purchased by a large company in New York City. I ended up moving from San Francisco to New York, and the corporate culture that I loved in that small company was gone. So I was being approached by headhunters, and for the first few years, I turned them all down. And then an offer came in, and I thought, well, maybe it's time. So a Fortune 500 company in New York ended up targeting me through a headhunter for a much more senior role, a managing director role. And because at that point I was a proven entity, I mean, they could look me up online and see that I had, I would speak at various conferences, and that some of them had experience with meeting me in person. So that was a very different stage of your professional development, of course. And it also meant that I felt comfortable pushing back. I was in a job that I still liked. It was still that most of my colleagues were the ones I had signed up with originally in San Francisco. So there was nothing to dislike. I had been doing well, and my salary had been increasing quite significantly. And again, I'm happy to share the number. By then, my complete compensation package was around $280,000. So that was a function of increasing base and increasing bonuses. The bonuses were never guaranteed, but we were doing well. So that was pretty comfortable outcome. And then one of the questions the human resource representatives from this company asked was, tell us your current salary. And they often do that because they then will come back to you and say, yeah, we'll give you an extra 20% or 30% above your current salary, which to many people looks like a really good deal. And at this point, I was aware of that, and I felt that it would make more sense for me to push back because, again, I could walk away. I had a job I was comfortable with. I liked the people. I would have been interested in a bigger adventure, but I felt comfortable pushing them to give me that adventure. So they ended up making me an offer, and they backed off from asking for the current salary, and they made me an offer which ended up being $450,000, right? So it was an 80% increase. Now this was, the sort of more stereotypical high stress, not quite Wall Street-like, but finance industry in New York job. And I ended up not staying there very long, even though the pay was obviously kind of jaw-dropping. But that's an example of when you're in a better position, when you feel comfortable, you feel more confident in your abilities, you can point to a lot of real things you've done and others can see it, you're really a proven quantity, then you have the leverage. Then you could choose to take it or leave it. Then you could push back. Oh, that's right. So how did I do that? I simply said to them that I didn't see how it was relevant. They had a particular job which required certain skills. I had those skills, and my current salary shouldn't have made any difference. And that was sufficient for them to just sort of back off. So they gave me the much higher salary, and they gave me a promotion. I was a director at the current job, and they made me a managing director. Come and negotiate. Oh, right. So we've seen that question. So I think so these are probably the final three things I'm going to emphasize. I've got a few more slides, so actually let's see what else is coming up. So the bottom line when an employer is looking for employees is this, right? They really they're focused on three things. Even if they're not explicitly thinking about this, ultimately their decision will be shaped through these three things, right? Can you do the job, which means do you have the technical skills? For that, they're going to assess, what's your PhD in? What have you done? What coursework have you taken? Whatever's relevant. What software packages are you comfortable with? And so on and so forth. And then the next question is, will you do the job? And this has to do more with your attitude. Do you have the discipline, the commitment, and professionalism to get the job done and do it well? And then the final one is, will you be fun to work with? Will you be likable? And so I'm coming back to that likable comment. Right? Will you fit well within their culture? That is really, really important. So it looks like we've got follow-up on, all right, so the correct number there was 450,000, not 480. And I'm trying to remember whether we started at 450 or something else. They may have actually made an offer that was lower. And I remember that I pushed back one or two times because I wanted to see how far I could push them. And I tried to be very, very polite along the way and just explaining that I was comfortable where I was. And they would, that's right, I remember, I actually used the phrase, I said to them, look, I'm pretty comfortable where I am. I've got upside here. So if you want me to come over, you're going to have to make me an offer I can't refuse. And then I hinted at what the numbers would look like. And so that's, as I recall, that's how they came up with that number. And at that point, I was doing cartwheels at home because I was so happy. So of course I was going to take that. All right, so moving on. So back to that theme I've already touched on of how important it is for you to practice, right? Interviewing and negotiating are learned skills. No one is born with the ability to be a brilliant interviewee or negotiator. We sometimes like to think that we're great at these things, but there's a lot of room to learn stuff. Speaking about ourselves is awkward, right? It goes against every instinct of being humble that we have. But the more we practice, the better we get. So you should practice with your peers, mentors, family members, anyone who agrees to sit down with you and run you through a mock interview or do whatever it is, run you through a case, which some employers will do. Do as much of this as you possibly can. You may feel self-conscious when you start. You may even feel silly sitting across from your husband or wife or spouse, partner, friend, whatever it is, and going through this pretend exercise. But thinking through the question and actually putting it into words and saying it out loud is already a big step forward than just thinking about it in your head. And as you say it, you'll already think about, oh, gee, I could have phrased that better. And the next time you do it, you will phrase it better. And the next time you'll be even more adept and you'll be able to introduce more subtlety in your answer. And all of that matters. So every person I've ever spoken with, myself included, I was a much better interviewee for my 6th interview than I was for the first one. And I was able to put a much better picture of myself out there. So consider you spend so much time getting to this point, so much time, undergraduate, master's, PhD work, bench work, whatever it is, blood, sweat, and tears for many of us. Why would you possibly show up unprepared to a negotiation or an interview when you could have done something, anything before that? Right? It makes no sense. Take all that hard-earned human capital and not be able to show that that's who you are, not be able to show the polished you. It's almost negligent, right, to do it at that point. So even though you're scrambling to finish the PhD and do the dissertation defense and then write it up and submit it in the right format and all that, you need to make time to practice interviewing and negotiating. These are skills that will serve you well throughout your entire career. So happy to entertain other questions. In fact, there is one there. What about negotiating things other than salary? Absolutely. You should negotiate everything. And as I mentioned before, as a package. So you really want to look at all of the terms, and the company should be perfectly comfortable once you're getting to the negotiation stage to send you their entire offer package, which should go through the benefits. So that would be the healthcare options, dental. There are even legal. There's legal insurance you can get, which means that some employers, we see this more in the corporate world, but you see it sometimes in not-for-profits. I think Hopkins has this as well, where you can pay a very small amount monthly, and that entitles you to getting legal assistance from attorneys who agree to participate in the program to help you with closing on a home purchase, put together household estate planning, and so on. So we've got all the health stuff covered. You've got the vacation, location flexibility, absolutely. Do I need to be in more than one office? Is there travel involved? Can I determine how much travel or not? If I'm traveling more than a 4-hour flight, can I fly business class? Yes, no. A lot of companies have policies about that. If the flight's long enough, they will give you the better seating. When I'm staying in hotels, what class of hotels am I staying in? Right? All of this stuff is relevant, and it's all potentially on the table. So the more you read and understand of what they're offering, the more you can craft that package that would be ideal for you and put it forward and see if you can negotiate. So I suppose a somewhat philosophical question, why do we end up with some people in similar jobs with presumably similar experience and capability getting paid differently because of negotiation skills? So is that unfair? I suppose, one way of looking at it, and I think a lot more could be said here, but certainly the rest of the world doesn't think it's unfair. So regardless of what conclusion we draw here, that's the world we have to live in. But you could also argue that negotiation is an important life skill and business skill. And today you may be an entry-level employee, an associate, but 5 years from now, you may be in a management position where you're negotiating with other companies. And your company is going to want to know that you're a good negotiator. So maybe it makes sense for them to reward people who show the capability of negotiating well. And of course, we could go on and on in depth with that one, but that's just some immediate thoughts. For practicing salary negotiation, anyone who's willing to sit down with you, but in particular, if it's a friend perhaps who graduated a couple of years before you and now is in that workspace within that industry, maybe they went through all these interviews before, they remember some of the questions, they might be good people. They would be ideal people because they've gone through the process. They remember what the room felt like. They can help you to set it up in a way that mimics as much as possible the experience you're going to have. And I'm a big fan of mimicking the experiences as much as possible. Put yourself as much as possible in that scenario. So wear a suit, sit down across from the interviewer and have them wear a suit. Sit down in a room that seems like it's an interview room, not the family rec room. Right? All of these things help you to remain focused because there are a few distractions, right? You're used to it. You're used to sitting across from someone in a suit and you're wearing a suit and your collar's tight and you're not used to it, but you at least had some practice because you wore a suit at home when you practiced, right? Whereas if it's the first time you're wearing a suit is in the interview, that's going to be uncomfortable. You're going to be fidgeting with your collar unnecessarily because you could have practiced with your suit on, right? An tie on or a full, whatever the appropriate outfit is. All right, so when you first see the contract, just wrapping up here quickly, acknowledge receipt and thank the employer, right? That shows that you're a professional, you're on the ball. Explain you're excited, be sincere. That shows them that they're hearing what they want to hear, that you're excited, they gave you the offer, and you're looking at it, and you may have some questions for them. And ask them if there's a deadline. Do they need to know within 3 days or 2 weeks? Usually they'll give you a week or two. They won't require you to give them 48-hour turnaround. And it can be reasonable to say, look, I'm looking at several offers. Can I have an extra week? But don't launch into a negotiation right there, right? So when you're getting back to them saying, yeah, thank you, I got your email, avoid diving into starting to negotiate stuff. It's okay to ask for clarification and more information, but don't start negotiating there. Because again, remember, you want to take a comprehensive view of everything, ask your questions from your various connections, and then put forward a reasonable, well-articulated basket of changes you would like to see in the offer. All right, I think we've, so there's, I'm not seeing any other questions, so I'll go ahead with the last 1 or 2 slides here. Or some random thoughts. If the employer pushes hard to impose unfair terms, you may not want to work there, right? So keep in mind that if you're asking very reasonable things and you've checked these and you really do feel that this is reasonable for me to ask, and they are being unreasonable, then maybe that's a reflection of their culture, and maybe that's not a place where you want to work. I know that's a difficult thing to consider when you're feeling desperate and you haven't got another offer and you feel like, I've got to take this job, right? So there is that dynamic there, but it can be a really bad move to take a bad job. So you do want to get a better sense. And I gave that example that I had, went up to New York, interviewed with an investment bank. They kept talking about how much money I could make, but it was so clear that there were conflicts in the room between the interviewers, and that was a reflection of uncomfortable situation that they just had through the entire unit. So, don't be desperate to please. Don't put yourself in a disadvantageous situation where you're just going to be miserable. It doesn't help you achieve any of your life goals. Any tips for negotiating where you're a woman? Any comments, gender, ethnic bias? So that is a huge topic. We touched on that just superficially before, but I think, so this is somewhat anecdotal based on my experiences interviewing various people who are often PhD level folks. I found that the women tended to more than the men, the women tended to exhibit a lack of confidence and some insecurity. And yet it was clear that they were as qualified and could do the job as well as anyone, regardless of how we're describing those various candidates. So my advice, based on my, I've been interviewed probably dozens of people in my career, maybe a little more than that, maybe 50, 60, is that for women to do enough preparation that you feel comfortable and more confident. I think that's probably a way to move the needle a lot. And again, recognizing that it's a very nuanced topic. There's a lot more to be said, and there's no way that I can do a satisfactory job for you, in a 30-second answer. So I apologize for that. Final question there, I like to put things in writing because then you have a trail of what was discussed, right? So I always like to put things in writing, by which I mean email. That way you can always say to them, remember when you said so-and-so when we were negotiating, here it is, here's the email. You said you would cover my moving expenses. So folks, we're at 1 p.m. I want to respect everyone's time. I'm sure you've got things to do. So I will stop here.